Hey everybody, I'm Vanessa Rose. I'm the CEO of American Composers Forum. This is Uneven Measures, which is our series with I Care If You Listen, reflecting on the 19th Amendment in this election year, 2020. This is supported by the Elizabeth and Michelle Sorrell Charitable Organization. And this is Understanding Intersectionality, Gender, and Other Identities with Melissa Dunphy and Tifa Gizweta. Jennifer Coe and Mary Kriemjian. Amanda Cook is facilitating. Welcome, everybody. We're so glad to have you here. And I'm going to hand off to our facilitator today, Amanda.
Thank you so much, Vanessa, for the introduction. We are thrilled to have you all here today. And I'm just going to start off by introducing our panelists. So each of them are going to just give you a brief overview of who they are and what they do as an artist. So Mary, do you want to start us off?
Sure. Hi, I'm Mary Kriemjian. I'm a music maker who works both in live music and documentary. And a lot of the work that I do explores social and political conflict in Armenia and the Middle East. I'm also an arts administrator. I'm a co-organizer of New Music Gathering, and I'm very proudly on the board of the American Composers Forum.
Thank you so much, Mary. Next, let's go to Melissa.
Hi, I'm Melissa Dunphy. I am mostly a composer, occasionally an amateur archaeologist. I live in Philadelphia, originally from Australia, and I am a mixed race Asian, come from an Asian Australian household, but I'm an immigrant, a child of immigrants. And most of my work is political or theatrical vocal music.
Thanks, Melissa. Next, we will go to Jenny.
Hi, I'm Jennifer Coe, and I'm a musician, and I think I'm somebody that really believes in activism through the arts and bringing awareness and voices that are not heard into the arts, and storytelling, as well as bringing more presence into the concert halls. I run a nonprofit called Arco Collaborative, and we put together this project called Alone Together, in which Inti was a part of. It's lovely.
Thanks, Jenny. And with that, we will go to Inti.
Hey y'all. Sorry, my internet's being a little wonky, so if I cut in and out, that's why. Yeah, my name is Dunphy Gizweta. I'm a composer living in New York City. I'm originally from Washington, D.C., kind of growing up specifically within predominantly Salvadorian and Black communities there. Kind of reflected in my background, a lot of public schools, charter schools, specifically kind of based around freedom school principles, which are related to 1964, like Freedom Summer. A lot of my work focuses on sociality, relationality, specifically in chamber music. And then a lot of my kind of working in the community is around kind of power analysis, thinking about representation, thinking about identities that are left behind in a lot of DEI initiatives, and kind of really trying to bring more complexity to everything.
Thank you all so much. So as you can all hear, we have some amazing artists and perspectives who are represented here today. But I did just want to take a moment right on the outset to recognize that there is one perspective that is obviously missing from this panel today, and that is the omission of Black artists. This was an oversight on our part as we were putting this panel together. And while this is not to undermine the perspectives of the artists that we have here today, we felt it was important to recognize that fact. We are going to give a brief overview of our topic for today, which is intersectionality. It's a big topic to tackle in 60 minutes, but we are going to give a basic definition, and then we will give each of our panelists an opportunity to talk about what intersectionality means to them. how we as an artistic community can be doing better to consider this topic in our day-to-day lives. And then we also hope to leave time at the end for a little bit of a Q&A. So if you have questions throughout the panel, go ahead and drop them in the chat, and we will hopefully have some time at the end to get to some of those questions. So first, I would like to just start with a basic overview of the concept of intersectionality. This is a term that was introduced by Kimberly Crenshaw, who is a scholar and a civil rights writer, critical race theorist, Black feminist, and expert on race and racism in the law. And while intersectionality is a term that has been coming up a lot lately, she actually developed this concept in 1989. So I'd like to start with just a brief video of Kimberly Crenshaw explaining this concept of intersectionality. I found a video where she really distills this down to its bare bones of the concept. In this particular video, she's talking about intersectionality as it applies to school programs. But if while we're listening to her speak, we can replace schools with arts institutions, I think we'll find that there are still a lot of relevant parallels. She's talking about the relationships between students and their teachers, administrators, their peers. And if we can also think about these relationships in terms of artists, how artists interact with mentors, with peers, with programmers and venues and people who are in decision-making power, then I think we can glean a lot from this short video. So I am going to share my screen so that we can all watch this video together. And here we go.
Intersectionality is just a metaphor for understanding the ways that multiple forms of inequality or disadvantage sometimes compound themselves, and they create obstacles that often are not understood within conventional ways of thinking about anti-racism or feminism or whatever social justice advocacy structures we have. Intersectionality isn't so much a grand theory, it's a prism for understanding certain kinds of problems. African American girls are 6 times more likely to be suspended than white girls. That's probably a race and a gender problem. It's not just a race problem, it's not just a gender problem. So I encourage people to think about how the convergence of race stereotypes or gender stereotypes might actually play out in the classroom, between teachers and students, between students and other students, between students and administrators, and commit themselves to understanding that as a way of intervening and providing equal educational opportunity for all students, regardless of their identities. Identity isn't simply a self-contained unit. It is a relationship between people in history, people in communities, people in institutions. So schools do a good job when they understand that and when they commit themselves to curricular development, to opportunities in the school for all students to understand the histories that have brought us to this particular moment. You can't change outcomes without understanding how they've come about. So independent schools can take the lead on that to be responsive to their student populations and to the communities out of which the students come.
So a lot packed into a very short video, but this at least gives us a working definition and a working concept of intersectionality that we can jump off from here today. And I think one of the most striking things about that explanation for me is intersectionality is often referred to as a theory, but here she defines it as a prism for understanding problems. So that's sort of the concept I'd like to start with here. So we're going to go around and I'm going to give each of our panelists an opportunity to just speak on this topic and how it plays a role in their lives as both an artist and as a person. So would any of you like to start? Well, I'm going to call on Mary then.
Oh, that's fine. I wrote something down anyway because it can be a little awkward in these life situations. So yeah, okay. So just hang with me for a few minutes. The ideas that stick out to me about intersectionality, aside from understanding the complexities of individuals and how they identify according to their own unique experiences and beings, are the ideas that translate into actionable steps that each and every one of us can take. So in order to create a world that truly celebrates diversity of perspective in the arts, we need to listen to others. We need to listen to individuals who have perspectives different than our own. And we need to understand our own privileges. And I'll start. I am an Armenian woman born here in the United States to parents who fled the Lebanese Civil War. What this means is I come from an ethnic group that neither unanimously identifies as white or Middle Eastern, that historically, upon their arrival to the United States after the Armenian genocide, when they faced racism from Americans for being starved or poor people, went to court to be considered white by the US government. By all means, while many of my cousins look brown, I look white, but culturally I grew up Middle Eastern. And what this means is that in classical music, I receive the privileges of a white woman as far as access to education, institutional support, and other opportunities I am both aware and unaware of. And while my music and ambiguous identity offer a safe exoticism to curators who often hope to check off in their diversity programming. And let's be clear, when it comes to Middle Eastern women, this is a community that often does not have the freedom of full expression without backlash here in the United States and without consequences of violence or arrest abroad. And I am lucky enough to live between these two identifiers, and that this has allowed me a space to safely express in the arts. And while my parents didn't have access to freedom of expression and education beyond high school and worked together every day, making sandwiches in a California equivalent of a bodega for 30 years, their work and generosity provided me the access to 3 university level degrees. I'm now completing my 4th at an Ivy League, and I live in a city which provides me with access to musicians, organizations, and immense opportunity. Now, we all experience and exist in different levels and forms of access, privilege, and prejudice, unique to not just communities as a whole, but to individuals. But each and every one of us, if we are working in the arts, if we have access to music making as what can seem to be a given fundamental means of expression, to be able to raise our voices without threat, if we have this, then we have privilege. And with this privilege comes a responsibility to research, to support, and to cherish the voices of communities who are not being heard, and to listen to them. For me, I don't want to only identify as a composer or a music maker or as a documentarian. I love the work with every bit of my soul, but the work is solitary. And while I've found myself often working in education and arts administration, like a lot of us do, I do these things because I want to be a community member. But I don't want to be a part of a community that looks the way it has for the past few hundred years, that continues to celebrate a white European male composer on his 250th birthday over celebrating the voices that reflect today's communities and times. I don't want to be a part of a community that today frantically puts band-aids over institutional racism and shortcomings and embraces tokenism. I want to be a part of a community of individuals and institutions that restructure, revisit their missions, and invite individuals who share different perspectives than their current power holders do to make decisions to move the arts out of the past and at the very least into our present with hopes for the future. And what this has meant for me as a board member of ACF and as a co-organizer in New Music Gathering is being a part of group efforts that are humbly learning and working to reevaluate who within our organizations are making decisions, to make space for different voices to participate and have opportunity, even if it means giving up our own decision-making and preferences, to do individual outreach and restructure opportunities in the application processes to actively, not passively, invite all artists to apply, not just the ones who have historically applied, and to bring anti-racism into the very foreground of our reimaginings for these organizations. And as an educator, it means I have a responsibility to share music that best represents the body of students I aim to reach. I teach a music history course in which the Western European canonical syllabus is rather strictly enforced by the university. This means that I am researching and teaching double the content so that I can supplement the enforced syllabus with works and performances by creators of color, as I have an ethical responsibility to do so, because we as educators all do. It means with my high school composition students, I only play the music created in their lifetimes because I want them to see and hear creators who they can see themselves in, so they know that they have a place in this world. And as a composer, this means that often I am recommending commissions to artists who can benefit from the opportunity more than I would. And this is very difficult, especially in the uncertainty of the arts economy that also hits close to home. And I'll be the first to say that I need to be better at doing this, because both my privilege and the hard work that I've put in over my lifetime mean nothing if I do not pay it forward. And when I do participate in a commission, I need to say something with it, that I consider my ancestors before me. I don't take my freedom of expression for granted, because it is a privilege. So these are some of the things that I think about when I think about intersectionality in the arts. And thank you.
Thank you, Mary. That's all so wonderful, especially just inspiring us to all take the responsibility to listen and examine and understand our own privileges, and not just fall on things like tokenism and as you mentioned, safe exoticism to put band-aids over this problem. Is there anyone who's feeling particularly inspired to to respond to Mary and go next and weigh in? Jenny, you want to go?
Okay, there's the unmute button. I think for those of you who don't know me, I'm Jennifer Coe, and I've been really fortunate to be able to have made a career in music. I really honestly believe if we can be here, it's really a miracle. So let me tell you a bit about myself. My performance career started early. I made my debut playing Paganini's first concerto with the Chicago Symphony at age 11, and I won the Tchaikovsky International Violin Concerto at age 17 at the end of my freshman year as an English major at Oberlin College. And, you know, lots of performance stuff that I've been lucky enough opportunities to have had. But I want to tell you a little bit about why I was able to have this career. So my career began because of the efforts of Zaran Mehta, the brother of Indian conductor Zubin Mehta. And as the president of the Ravinia Festival in Chicago at the time, he gave me my first recital, introduced me to members of the classical music world. And because of his efforts and advocacy, I had the chance to meet Isaac Stern, who then advised me to study with Jamie Laredo at the Curtis Institute of Music, who then recommended that I meet and play for Felix Gallermeyer, who began mentoring me, directing me to attend the Marlborough Music Festival. So most importantly for my identity though, I am the daughter of Korean refugees. My mother is originally from North Korea and spent her early childhood walking down the entirety of the Korean Peninsula during the war. She came to the United States in 1965 on an F1 student visa and was able to apply for citizenship as a direct result of changes to US immigration policy with the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, which was also a corrective to the Chinese Exclusion Act. Despite having begun her life running from mortar fire and begging for food, she made her way to the United States earned a PhD in library science, and taught at Dominican University for over 30 years. And my mom gave me every opportunity that she did not have as a child, including a consistent education, violin lessons, and tickets to concerts. So my mother's history, which lives in me and is by extension mine, is a familiar one for immigrants and specifically Asian Americans. I'm a part of this first generation of children born to this new wave of immigrants who arrived after 1965, not of European descent, from outside of the West. And as a member of this new kind of American, I'd like to tell you a little bit about my experiences as an Asian American female in classical music. So I wanted to share this about my life in order to illustrate the impact that the choices, actions, and efforts of individuals made on my life. The individuals who opened doors for me at crucial points in my life, both for musical development and for my career. And it transformed the course of my life and gave me the life I have today. So I guess I want to communicate that each and every one of us has the capacity to create great impact on individual lives in our communities. And each one of us has the ability and power to be an active and transformative participant in history. So there's an American historian, Grace Swan, who uses the term innate capacity to describe the capital that is placed on the belief that different types of music originate from and therefore belong to a certain group of people from a specific place. It means that an asset or an inheritance exists, an essence one is born into. So this is not an asset available for accumulation in classical music because of the belief that mechanics such as technique can be imitated and practiced. Rather, the essence of music, its heart, its soul, and its spirit is felt most palpably through bloodlines. So basically what this means is that when one says that a musician just understands Mozart or Schubert because that person is Viennese and is from Vienna and it flows through their blood, we are also saying that a person that is not Viennese, a person that is not of the West, a person not born with European blood, a foreigner, can never truly understand or express the essence of music. So it's been a major trope that I've heard throughout my life that Asians may have great technique and be able to play all the notes, but they do not possess the soul to understand music. And in recent years, I realized that I'm fortunate, but in recent years, the trope has been amended and is now Asians can play all the notes, but don't truly understand music, but not you. So during my 3 decades as a performing musician, as a non-white classical musician, the existence of my soul has been questioned numerous times. And as a member of the model minority, I have witnessed the use of the stereotype that while I might excel at the mechanics of music through technique, I do not possess a true understanding of the essence of music. So here are just a few examples. This is from 1997. I hope I'm not talking too long, but this is from 1997, and it's actually a review, which says Jennifer Coe, a 20-year-old American-born violinist, sounded like a prototypical competition circuit graduate. She played with splendid technique, fine pitch, impressive power, and barely a whit of poetry or imagination. So this stereotype of technician without creativity or soul has followed me throughout my career. This is from 2012, which is much more recent. Soloist Jennifer Coe came with many accolades. Her pitch, rhythm, and technique are flawless, but her performance lacked any sense of soul, and it was hard to watch her. Another stereotype, I possess the inscrutable Asian face from 2013, but who is Coe as an interpreter, personality? she certainly had all the notes. And finally, the comments on my Asian femaleness is hypersexualized, limiting me to a binary role of the Asian woman as either the pure, innocent schoolgirl or the oppositional role of dragon lady. So these responses to my musicianship in relation to my race increased my awareness of other marginalized people in Western classical music and our tenuous positions as non-white persons without agency leave us open to constant questioning of our belonging and inclusion. So when I was coming of age, Asian Americans, women, non-binary or people of color were nearly non-existent. And I feel incredibly lucky that I was nurtured and mentored by members of the classical music community, but especially people like Felix Gallimere, who advocated for my inclusion. And I want to thank him for sharing his own stories of being the victim of derision and racism when he was a young Jewish violinist in the Vienna Philharmonic. And he only lived because Bronislaw Huberman, another prominent Jewish violinist, saved his life by putting him on a boat in 1936. So we have a great deal of responsibility to look at our history of classical music and to understand that we have the power and the implications, for example, of people like Bronislaw Huberman, who saved the life of my teacher, Felix Gallimere. And by extension, he allowed me to come into this world and into this classical music business because he advocated for me. So a recent study, I'm saying all of these things because I believe that Asian Americans are often invisible. We have adjacent kind of experiences of racism, but we are often self-silenced, but we also are invisible. So that's why I continue with this. So a recent study released by the Harvard Business Review in 2018 revealed that Asian Americans are the least likely ethnic group in the US to be promoted to managerial or executive positions. According to this report, it's easy to understand why Asian American representation may not seem to be an issue. This is similar to classical music, right? In some key ways, Asian Americans are the most successful demographic group in the United States. As a group, Asian Americans are more highly educated with higher median incomes than any other racial group in the country. But because we are highly represented, Asian Americans are given little priority or attention in diversity programs. And in the end, this report reveals that although diversity programs have helped groups like white women, out of all ethnic and gendered groups, Asian American women are the least likely to be promoted to any leadership position. And any Asian-related programs that do exist are geared towards cultural inclusion programs, which involves the ethnic origin cultural program, and are not diversity programs for those Americans, those non-white Americans who are Asian. A couple of things that are also I think interesting to note is that in 2019, the Economic Policy Institute revealed that when comparing the wages of Asian American women and white men with the same education, Asian American women make 69 cents to the dollar. White women make 75 cents to the dollar. And this kind of bamboo ceiling is even more pronounced in classical music. There's this 2016 report by the League of American Orchestras saying that 9% of orchestral musicians in the United States are Asian or Asian American. They make no differentiation between Asian immigrants and Asian Americans. So we're never included as an actual presence as Americans, as non-white Americans, but rather as a perpetual foreigner. So now what do we do with this? So I've feel fortunate that I've become more empowered within classical music and more mindful of the history of classical music with its racial and gender biased construction. And I ask myself what actions I can take and all of us can take to build and create the world that we want to live in. So I think the first most important thing is what all of us here, like Inti and Mary and Melissa do, which is that we are simply present, and we're complicated, and we exist. And we're complicated presences in classical music, a business, and a place that might not necessarily want us to be here. So just by existing, I think to some degree, this is actual advocacy. The other thing I actively try to do is to advocate for women and people of color, because I believe that doing so will help all of us imagine a present and future world of classical music that expands our artistic community and audiences and truly represents and engages with the larger communities that we live in. And I believe that we can build a community that does transcend the categories of gender, sexual orientation, and race. So in my experience, I've been lucky enough to work with a great deal of many gifted composers, including Inti, Taishan Sori, Vijay Iyer, Courtney Bryant. So I've been incredibly fortunate. But we have built mostly projects that are based on engaging with issues of race and sexism and social societal concerns. It's also been about actually telling my story. So I've created a work with Devon Tynes called Everything That Rises Must Converge, which is about the parallel experiences of our grandfathers and of my mother. And the title comes from a Flannery O'Connor collection of short stories, but is also about the coming together of specifically the Korean American and African American experience. There's historically been a great deal of tension, specifically in Los Angeles, which is actually, again, this is about acknowledging that there are Asian Americans that are actually American. So this is again about telling the story of the immigrant that came here and who existed as a majority in their country versus then the experience of a non-white American female, such as myself. So in other words, I think that there is a great deal of change that can still happen. And I am really thrilled to be on this panel with all of you guys.
Thank you so much, Jenny. What an amazing story. And I think one of the really interesting things you highlight is how you have had many people who have extended that hand and opened a door for you. But it, I think, makes us take a step back at the same time and realize that we're working within a system that's reliant on individuals kind of extending that hand and breaking down those barriers. So thank you. Melissa, I saw you nodding along in agreement through a lot of what Jenny was saying. So
Yeah.
would you like to weigh in?
Both Jenny and Mary, I mean, I'm kind of glad that I didn't make a prepared speech because I literally would just be saying a whole bunch of the same things that both of you have said. But the parts that are different, I mean, some of the things that really hit me as like, wow, that's also part of my story is, you know, my parents were also refugees. My mother from China, she swam from China to Hong Kong in 1972 to get out of the Cultural Revolution, and brought a lot of that trauma with her to Australia. I am a mixed race Asian, but I grew up identifying as completely Asian because I had an Asian stepdad and I grew up in this Asian household. And a thing to note about Australia is it's actually way more xenophobic than even America is. It is 80% white. And Asians in the 80s and the 90s, when I was growing up, were kind of the evil, scary foreigner du jour that everybody was like, Asians are coming here and changing our culture. And, you know, it's not going to be Australia anymore. So my mother came to Australia in the midst of that very racist environment. And something that I've been grappling with my whole life is the perspective of being the outsider in almost every way, in every part of my life. You know, my mother, having experienced that racism, chose very deliberately to only teach me English when I was a little girl. And not to teach me Chinese. She speaks Cantonese and Mandarin. She didn't teach me any of that. My biological father spoke Greek. He was illiterate in English, but I didn't learn Greek either. There was a very concerted, deliberate decision for me to only speak English. And then I also fulfilled that Asian stereotype of being trotted off to piano classes and violin lessons. And, you know, this very stereotypical, the Asian kid who does Western classical music on piano and violin, like these accepted instruments. And when I was a little older, I got into acting, and the kind of acting that I loved to do was this very like Anglophilic Shakespeare. I was a huge Shakespeare nut. I still am. And it took me a long time, really, until I moved to America. And once again, found myself even more the outsider, discovering American culture from the perspective of someone who had never lived here before, who knew about America only from, you know, television shows. I started looking back at some of the stuff that I grew up with, and realizing that everything that I'm interested in also stems from the fact that white supremacy is in the air we breathe, that my parents packaged it and gave it to me as well. That, you know, I think there's a very good reason why so many Asian kids go into Western classical art music, because culturally, Western classical art music is seen as this pinnacle of white European culture. And, you know, again, and why did I go into Shakespeare? Why was I super into Shakespeare? Because I was being funneled into this idea of you need to belong. You need to prove to yourself that you can handle yourself in this white environment. So you need to become even whiter than white people, even though at the end of the day, nobody thought of me as white. You know, I had many conversations in high school with people, like I would walk in on people being overtly racist against Asians, like saying awful things about Asians coming to Australia and taking their jobs. And I would pipe up and say, excuse me, you're talking about me and my family. And like Jenny, I had the experience of them saying, oh, but you're different. And like, what does that mean? You know, and just that weird tension between those two realities for me. I didn't think about it very much when I was a teenager. I didn't think about it until I came to America and went through the whole outsider thing very and in a fresh way. So to me, intersectionality is about it's like a personal process that you then externalize, right? Like I think like a lot of processes, it's like you have to know yourself to understand your own position in the world, your own biases, your own privilege, in order to interact with the world in a way that that improves it in terms of like equity and equality and things like that. So I've been constantly, since I moved to America, that was 17 years ago, discovering and interrogating all the ways that white supremacy and patriarchy and colonialism kind of infect our environment. And that's not to say pass judgment on them, like, you know, truth be told, it's like, I still love those dead white German guys that I grew up with. My first musical language was, you know, Bach and Mozart, and I still love them. You know, I love that music. It is my first language. It's the language that I write music in. But I also want to understand why that happened and figure out, you know, what my place in that world is and what I can do to make it easier and better for the next generation, to diversify that, you know, so that the next generation doesn't think of Bach as the be all and end all pinnacle of white intellectual music. And if you want to be smart, you better be learning like all of the 3-part inventions by heart, kind of thing. You know, because I don't think that that's true. And I think that that's an idea that has funneled down to everyone involved in classical music in really insidious ways. I'm very lucky as someone who primarily does a lot of vocal music, that as a composer, I mean, all composition is collaborative because you compose something, you give it to a performer, and that's a collaboration. But as a vocal music writer, I get to collaborate with people who write texts. And this is a very, very cool and obvious way to figure out like what the voice is. Who am I centering in this story? You know, is it who is by default being centered in this story? When we sing something, when we play a character on stage, when we say someone's words, we are being forced to see something through their perspective. And for hundreds of years, everyone within our field has basically been forced to get inside the head of white men, to the point where that's the default, and we're very comfortable doing that, you know? So what does it mean when we encourage people to get inside the head of a woman? What does it mean when we encourage people to get inside the head of a person of color? You know, shouldn't male TTBB groups be singing poetry and music by women or by non-male composers the same way treble groups have been singing music by male composers forever, right? So there's ways to me that that intersectionality comes into the work that I do, and also with the end goal of thinking about how the next little girl aged 4 or 5 who is being taken to music lessons for the first time, how she's going to see the world. You know, will she realize that those covert messages that, you know, Mozart is the be all and end all of music, and you have no hope of becoming like the dead white German genius? You know, is there a way of dismantling that so that the next generation doesn't get that message? To me, classical music needs to go in at that ground level, thinking about like kids coming up through the ranks before we can reform what I think of as sort of, you know, above the clouds, the professional world. We have to think about that pipeline coming in. So that's what I believe intersectionality and classical music, how they interact.
Thank you so much. And Melissa, you mentioned patriarchy, white supremacy, and colonialism infecting our environment. And I want to bring Inti in here. I know these are things that you have thoughts on. So Inti, what does intersectionality mean to you?
Sure. Hey, thank you all. You've been really amazing contributions. I guess I'll maybe give some historical context to like my own place in all of this, and then maybe kind of tackle it from there. I grew up also immigrant kid, biracial. My mom is Andean from Ecuador, and indigenous peoples there. And I grew up in a charter school that was run out of a kind of liberation theology church called St. Stephen's in Washington, D.C., and kind of around Mount Pleasant and Columbia Heights. The school was a freedom school. It was called Elsie Whitlow Stokes, and it was run with kind of these deep principles of community, of communication, of nonviolent learning, of community singing, coming together, like really regular kind of dialogue between teachers, and liberatory pedagogy in a lot of different ways. That didn't stop the fact that like when I was learning music as a kid who kind of had trouble focusing, that, you know, there was still, you know, don't beat on that drum like a savage kind of vibe, which kind of still kind of osmosis through a little bit. And, you know, kind of part of being immigrant and being super, super poor was like a severe lack of music lessons and of kind of access to arts in general. I ended up going to middle school and high school that didn't really have music programs, going to community art centers, the Latin American Youth Center, which was a youth center that had an art house program that kind of did beats and a bunch of kind of, it was like this really beautiful multi-tiered house, and each floor was like dedicated to a different medium. So like the bottom was like photography, the middle was like muraling, the kind of second floor was music making, and then the top floor was painting. And it was just a really beautiful space, you know, running up and down and really kind of being able to meet people doing all kinds of things. So that was one space that was really important to me growing up. Another place was called Sitara Center. It was kind of near Adams Morgan, and through those you were able to take private lessons. They still cost money. I didn't really take them formally, but they did let me into their instrument room. So like for years I was just kind of like plucking on things and stuff, like very disorganizedly. Part of growing up in DC and like the schools that I was going to too was this kind of overwhelming concept that if you wanted to have a level of social and economic mobility as people of color, especially like the environment and community that I was part of was 97% like American Black folk, Ethiopian immigrants, Salvadoran immigrants, and Mexican immigrants, where there was this kind of, you need to go into science, you need to go into math, you need to go into a practical skill that will be able to kind of give you the money and resources to help your family, and you know, kind of a big focus on that. That also kind of followed me into high school. Similar kind of vibe there. I was part of like the Math and Science Academy. I ended up having a really amazing teacher named Dr. Smith. She was this super amazing Black woman, taught calculus, also worked the door at Blues Alley in Georgetown, and like would bring me into shows sometimes, and like always had an open invite for stuff. She ended up having a contact at American University who was able to secure a scholarship that was for DC students to go to American University because they literally had no DC students in their school. Which like, yeah, again, like an area that has so many private universities, not having a state university, you know, there was some pipeline issues there. You know, from there, I was able to, I like accidentally took a music program, got into music, really loved doing it. And along the way have really just been encouraged, like mostly by my family, and then kind of meeting some really amazing mentors along the way. Felipe Lara, Marcos Balter, able to do some study with George Lewis. And this has just been in the last couple of years that I've really been able to kind of access that, those amazing, amazing minds. So intersectionality, that word means a lot of things. I think it's a really fancy word sometimes. I probably think of it like most rootedly as like, why do I not see the communities that I grew up in any of the spaces that I make music in? Why is there not a contingent of like Black, Latinx, Indigenous composers, Afro-Latinx, Afro-Indigenous composers? Like, why are these people not with me in this space? What are what is the way in which, like, what are the mechanisms of power that I was able to tap into, that I was able to enter the flow into, that I know that people around me were not able to. So that's probably like the most basic way of thinking about it for myself. Another part of history a little bit is just that my parents are community organizers in DC. They did a lot of campaigns in DC, specifically around tenant organizing, helping some organizations around language access, specifically getting government documents translated to Amharic, to Spanish, to Mandarin, to everyone, so that there was able to be this kind of level of accessibility. So there's always kind of been a complex lens that I grew up in and around of what don't people have? Why don't they have those things? And how can we facilitate and help others to achieve those things that we ourselves have? You know, I think that I try and see that as like what I think a function of intersectionality is like, why am I here? Why am I able to do this? And why aren't other people able to do this? And how can I bring them into that? So that's kind of the like political and just like the, I don't know, the lens in which I live and function and everything. I know that that interacts in my music a lot because my music is all about relationality. It's all about sociality. It's all about trying to bring out people's voices, about combining materials and generative processes in real time that that disrupt tendencies of classical music, of how things are voiced, orchestrated, registrated, who is at the foreground at any time, all of that stuff. And so it all kind of jumbles in my mind a lot. And then I guess the last thing that really kind of comes to mind is figuring out like what policies and what policies of institutions are the things in which like people fall through the cracks of. I know that we're talking about pipelines. I had an amazing conversation with Rebecca Siegel. They were the executive director of ICE for like a year or two, and they're super amazing. And they made this really amazing chart for me that I had never really seen before. Like, I'm not a policy person, but this chart had these like areas that people are in, and then these arrows, and every like between every arrow, there was kind of a idea of recognizing how people might be lost in that process. Be it kind of a process of mentorship, of development, of opportunities, of all that stuff. And so that's kind of stuck in my mind a lot. That might be it.
Thank you, Inti. So one thing that I wanted to bring up was, as we were all planning for this conversation, we started talking about the difference between personal solidarity between artists versus the need to kind of take down the big bad institutions. So I'm wondering if anyone wants to speak on that topic.
I'm always troubled as far as institutions go. I'm not sure that I would make an argument that like every large institution needs to be taken down, but I do think that these larger institutions need to be, like I keep thinking back to Natalie Joachim gave the keynote speech at New Music Gathering, and she kept saying over and over again, do the work. And I think that we need to hold these larger institutions accountable for revisiting their mission statements, for looking at who's hired in the institutions, who's making the decisions, who's curating, who's like, who are you surrounding yourself with? And does that reflect the community that you want to serve as well, and the artists that you want to support? But I think some other folks on this panel maybe even have a different view than I do, as far as just take it down and start fresh.
It's complicated. I think it's complicated, right? Like when I look at the record of, for example, the Metropolitan Opera, I don't know what you can do to reform it with the structure of it currently. You know, 113 years between operas by a woman. You know, 1903 and then 2016, that's it. 2 operas by a woman. Meanwhile, they've mounted the magic flute literally 450 times since 1883. Like, given what they've done and what they do, I don't even know if their mission includes, you know, the idea of diversity. So when I first started as a composer, I used to think that like the dream would be to have an opera, you know, premiered at the Met or commissioned by the Met or whatever. And now in 2020, I'm literally thinking that if they came to me, I would struggle with the idea, like, you know, like the idea that I would be like, am I being tokenized right now? Are you just trying to save your reputation? What's in it for me? What's in it for, you know, women? What's in it for people of color, actually? And so I think that institutions who are thinking about these issues really, you know, are you ready for total reform from the bottom all the way up to the top? You know, are you ready for that? And if you're not, where is your institution going?
I'd also like to make a note that the Metropolitan Opera continues to do Yellowface in Toronto, and the year that they were last season, they were very proud of Porgy and Bess, and at the same time they had 2 operas playing with Yellowface. but you were asking about institutions, and I turn it always back to myself and think about what my responsibility is, what is my privilege. And institutions are made up of people and they're making choices. And one might say that it's just institutional, but these are constant and consistent choices that people are making to be willfully ignorant, right? We all, I talked about people like Zarin or people like Felix because one realizes that it really takes one person. It takes me, right? It takes you, it takes, and the time to change it is now, and it's really just, I'm tired of waiting. Right? So it's like we all individually, even on this call, we can make the effort, right? So I see institutions as being made up of human beings and people. And I oftentimes just try to imagine what responsibility I have to have contributed to that, and what actions have I decided to make to counteract white supremacy, for example, or just white supremacy in the field.
And that's interesting that you are conceiving of these institutions of individual members. And Inti, this sort of ties in a little bit to what you were thinking in terms of ensembles, because again, this is just still a group of individuals, and thinking about how artists interact with ensembles versus how they interact with institutions. Did you want to speak about that?
Totally, yeah, I remember. Yeah, I mean, I think that like when we're talking about intersectionality too, we're also, and institutions and access, we're also talking about like the capacity for the institutions, the ensembles, the structures that we currently have to even express and understand the truths that are being expressed by artists that are not part of those systems, that are not like, didn't have a childhood being indoctrinated with, I mean, I'm sorry, like being indoctrinated with white supremacy, being indoctrinated with the aesthetics, the goals, the missions, like all of those things that kind of define our idea of like what artistic excellence is, what a goal of an ensemble is when creating a non-white music. I feel like there does have to be an approach from ensembles and from institutions when they're engaging with artists that are not, that they are saying are part of their expanded mission statement. Thank God it's 2020 and they're doing it now instead of 20 years ago. But when they're doing that there has to be a transformation in the way in which they're engaging with like artists that are coming from outside those doors, outside like those ideas themselves. Like I don't think, for example, I don't think that rehearsals and rehearsal processes for orchestras, for chamber orchestras, for large ensembles can remain the same when you're engaging with people who are creating music that isn't notated a lot of the time, B, isn't trying to be expressed along those medium lines, and C, like requires a kind of like internalization of those and a kind of seeing of those artists who are being brought into that space that I just don't think like really happens a lot. Like I think we get a lot of half-assed performances and then like it just like doesn't move in the same way. And that it's not that like any art, like I don't know if it's any artist is like particularly at fault if we're talking about individuals, but that there is like not a recognition of the ways in which the structures themselves have to warp and like be responsive to the people in which they're bringing into the space and their views and their perspectives and their forms of art making.
Well, I think that's an amazing way to kind of wrap things up and summarize this conversation today. Thank you to all of our panelists for your incredible insight and spending your time with us. And thank you to everyone who joined us this afternoon. And I believe I'm going to pass things back off to Vanessa Rose, who may have some closing statements, or we may have a couple of closing acknowledgements here. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today, and have a great weekend.
Thank you so much. I'll be fast. I know we're right at 2 o'clock. Thank you so much to our panelists, Mary, Melissa, Jennifer, and Inti, and to Amanda for facilitating. This was an incredible conversation. As I mentioned at the top, we are recording, and somebody mentioned this in the chat box, we will be making this available on our websites. So you can watch it again. I definitely plan to and can share with others. For everybody that's here on this panel call, we definitely want to continue to share your stories, incredible work that you're doing. We just talked about how important it is for each of us as an individual to do our part and to challenge those who need to do better. So please send what you're doing to us. We want to make sure that we're amplifying the work that you're doing. That's what we're here to do, and utilize our network for that. I just want to make sure you also know that we have one more panel as part of this series coming up. That's this Monday. It's about advocating for gender equity, and it's going to be at 5 o'clock. Eastern, 4 o'clock Central. More information can be found at composersforum.org or icareifyoulisten.com. And I also wanted to make sure that you all remember to vote. If you have any questions about deadlines, about how to get involved in the effort, there's still time. A great resource page, composersforum.org/vote-2020. And if you are in a position to contribute to the work that we're doing here so that we can keep doing these kind of panels and important conversations, please consider a donation at americancomposersforum.org/donate. And just thank you again to everybody, and let's keep doing the work. Thank you.